Okay, here we are. We have arrived at the Wheel of Fortune.
Our namesake.
Yeah, our namesake, and nearly the center of our sequence of 22 major arcana. We're on the 11th card, but number 10. Okay, so the title of Wheel of Fortune is, well, we see it called The Wheel, we see it called Fortune, we see it called The Sphinx. I've actually seen that for obvious reasons we'll talk much more about later. I also saw, here's a funny one, the Omnium Dominatrix, which is the mistress of everything.
That's interesting.
Nice, right? And then Hermetic, Lord of the Forces of Life, is that correct?
Yes, Lord of the Forces of Life.
Right. It's really interesting to think about the personification of fortune. You know, in the older versions, you see Fortuna, and sometimes she's blindfolded and sometimes she's not. But there's this sort of idea of a female goddess, whereas we also have this association with Jupiter, the father god that we're going to be talking lots about, Zeus. And, you know, pretty much you just find the wheel symbolism everywhere, in every religion, you know, in every culture. There's this acknowledgement that there are forces that are beyond our control.
If the wheel stopped for you, everyone else would fall off, as they say. Where shall we start?
Let's talk about the animals. Can we talk about the animals first?
Sure, let's talk about the animals.
I really want to talk about the animals because that's something that we find, it's so esoteric looking and it dates back so far. You know, even in the Marseille cards, you always have 3 animals, and you know, you have some symbol of kingship at the top, and then you have the ass ascending and the monkey descending, and we don't associate those Marseille decks with all of this information that we talk about in this podcast, but those are cognate with what we see here. So all right, so Waitsmith first, shall we?
Sure.
Okay, so this is the image that you grew up with, painted by your mother, right?
Yes, on the kitchen wall. A very enigmatic image by which to eat breakfast.
To imprint upon at an impressionable age over your cereal. So we have at the very top the Sphinx, right? The sordid Sphinx, which is its own thing, right? What's up with the sordid Sphinx?
Well, I think the sword is could be a reference to the powers of, you know, reason and discernment in the way. Well, this is, well, I'm going to say that word interesting again. I tend to say that about nearly everything in these cards. But one thing I noticed was that in Waite's card, he mentions the Sphinx as being the Mercury figure. So these 3 figures alchemically are Mercury, sulfur, and salt. Waite considers the Sphinx the Mercury figure.
Seriously?
Yes.
That doesn't make any sense at all.
Well,
I don't like it.
Yeah. Well, and that in the Crowley card, it's the sulfur figure. So he says the sword is, you know, bringing in the action of sulfur. If that's true, then that would be a real philosophical difference. So it would be like, Waite would be saying that the clarity is at the top of the wheel, you know, the function of clarity, which is the Mercury of the triad of the 3 gunas. That's the one of lucidity and clarity, whereas the other one is action. Crowley would be saying, you know, top of the wheel is action. To go, you know, doing.
Well,
and the other one is thinking and getting clear, and intelligence.
Right. Well, do you have a source for Waite other than the pictorial key? Because it's not in the pictorial key.
I wonder if I read that, and I think that might have been in Wang's book. You want me to go get it?
Yeah,
check?
actually,
because I think he was the one who said that, but I'm not positive.
Okay.
I'm sure I read that.
Okay, so Mel found the reference in Robert Wang's Kabbalistic tarot that associates the Sphinx with philosophic Mercury. So
so he starts by saying that Crowley states that the Sphinx is sulfur, Hermanubis is Mercury, and Typhon is salt, and then says the Golden Dawn, on the other hand, would allow the Sphinx to be considered nothing less than the superconsciousness Sattva, the philosophic Mercury. And we see that in Waite's card, the Sphinx sits above the Mercury sign on the wheel.
So that makes sense, I guess. I mean, it's annoying that they're not the same, but she is sitting directly above the Mercury symbol in the wheel. She's got a sword, which is airy, like Mercury.
Yeah, so if we look at that inner circle, if you're looking at the card, that Mercury symbol is right under her, and then the serpent has the salt symbol on that inner wheel. And the sulfur symbol is next to the dog-headed figure, and then
you may be wondering why Aquarius, but it's actually probably a reference to water.
Yeah, it's supposed to be either dissolution or water, and I was thinking water, well, they're kind of the same thing, dissolution, solution, and water, but that then brings it into 4, so where these could also correspond to the 4 elements. So you'd have water, fire, probably fire for sulfur, salt would then be earth, and mercury for air. Because this card has a 8-spoked wheel, so we've got,
So he had to have
4.
And they're a little hard to see because they've got the lines, the cardinal direction lines through them, but that's what's intended. Okay, so we have the Sphinx who...
But I thought it was I was just reflecting on, so doesn't that show a real departure in philosophy where Crowley puts the sulfur on top of the wheel in action, the active element on the wheel, whereas the Golden Dawn had the super consciousness, the knowledge, the clarity and knowledge on top of the wheel. Right. So, their philosophy was to learn, where his was to take that learning and move forward with it, I guess.
I guess so. I mean, that's, Crowley is all about the active application of whatever it is you got. The reason I was so uncomfortable with the Sphinx as air is because of the Hermanubis figure. And
well, I wouldn't say it's exactly air. I mean, it is air. The way Waite's card shows it as the 4 spokes and makes one of them water, and clearly is trying to make it elemental. What Crowley says about these 3 gunas, he says that they're not exactly the elements. They're not exactly the alchemical references. They're not exactly the, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. They're not exactly anything. He said the word is actually undefinable and untranslatable, and it incorporates all of those things. He says it's kind of like all of those things and very fluid. And the word guna itself,
that he also says is
he calls it untranslatable, but I've heard it referred to as tendencies. So it's not an exact thing, it's a tendency. Then there's a root of the word that means threads, which is interesting. So a tendency or a thread, when I think of threads too, it brings back the whole, the fates spinning the threads on the wheel. So I thought that was kind of cool that the word has a root of that within it.
Yeah, well, I'm just kind of trying to justify in my mind the association with the sulfur symbol with this rising.
Well, doesn't it make sense to you that? No. Well, you mean in
the Wade card? Yeah.
I actually. Now, I know it's probably wrong, or maybe there is no wrong, but here's something very strange. When I was young and used to stare at this picture, I always considered that supposed Hermanubis figure as Typhon.
Oh, did you really?
And I didn't think that was wrong, because what I learned later when I first started looking into it is that's the Set animal. You ever see the Set animal?
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, the Set animal was a jackal. Was related to Typhon. Okay. So the Set animal had, a jackal-like head, and had a dog body with a bifurcated tail, or was that head on a human body, which looks like what we see here. Because to me, that doesn't look. I suppose it could be a Hermanubis, but to me it looks like a Set. And that's also the same head that's the wasp scepter, where the scepter has that animal-like head with the forked ears, and then the bottom has the bifurcated spoke at the bottom. So
could be.
Anyway, then this would be the Set animal if that's Typhon. But they're both. See, it's weird because and
Typhon is supposed to be a serpent-like figure too.
But then I was thinking about that serpent, and it could be the Apep serpent, the serpent of chaos. And in which case they're kind of like the same thing. Like at one time, Typhon was, or Set actually, Set was the defender of Ra against the serpent of chaos. It wasn't always that Set was considered evil.
Yeah.
That kind of came along later in the Egyptian cosmology, like earlier, and you might have to ask a true Egyptologist, like, to define when. But earlier, Set defended Ra against the serpent Apophis or Apep. Apep, I don't know how they said it. And it kind of speaks to how in the Egyptian mythos, evil was a result of man's struggles against non-existence. And that speaks to the whole wheel of samsara, the cycle of necessity of that we're on and, can't seem to get off.
Right, which we see throughout this card or in any mandala type figure that you look at. I can also see serpent as salt, being close to the earth, tied to the earth. And, that figure, the red figure, which you thought was Typhon and which I thought was Hermanubis, is also kind of a demonic looking figure,
right,
sulfuric.
A red devil.
A red devil. I always thought, before learning any of this stuff, I always thought it was a red devil. Because why not, And so it's all in how you look at it. But I think there's supposed to be, the ascending figure and the descending figure, are in some sense supposed to be moral lessons. I think the idea that, there's an ambition that goes with ascending up the wheel and then an inevitable downfall afterwards.
Another thing that Wang said about that figure, and I don't know if he says that Case was the one who called that figure Hermanubis, and that it's really Hermes, not Hermes and Anubis, but Horus and Anubis. So it's actually a figure called Heru M. Anpu, which is Horus as Anubis. And it was the leader of souls into the underworld. And as such was considered a good beneficial figure, but also terrifying.
Yeah. Well, the animals on the Crowley card are a little bit less confusing, I think.
Totally, yeah. It's much more clear who's who and what's what.
And what's what. We have, the Sordid Sphinx, but in this case associated with sulfur, right?
Yep.
And then we have on the left, which you can also see on our banner for Fortune's Wheelhouse, you can see the monkey,
Cynocephalus ape,
and that's clearly Mercury, the companion of Mercury, thought to be the companion in the Hall of the Dead, right? But also the
Hall
reminder.
Of Two Truths.
Yeah.
The weighing of the heart against the soul's
under
falsity
the jurisdiction
or
of Ma'at.
truth.
Right. And then there's also his role as the distorter of the word, but he goes along with Mercury Psychopomp. And as Mercury is sort of the alchemical Mercury acts as an agent connecting sulfur and salt, which would salt being the Typhon figure here, descending.
Right, the crocodile looking like being
immensely sinister.
So he's supposed to be the son of Gaia, and his parentalship is a bit under dispute, but usually he's the son of Gaia and Tartarus. Tartarus being the personified abyss. So the son of Earth and the abyss. Rather interesting.
Right. Cast down by Zeus with his thunderbolt, which is actually dramatized in this card with thunderbolts everywhere.
Yeah, Zeus, before he casts him down, he says, I'm gonna cast you down and I'm gonna raise a tomb over you that says something like, Son of Earth, who the fire of heaven burnt up.
Insult to injury. And also he's got the Ankh in one hand and the crook of Osiris in the other. So he's separating them.
the life of the Osiris figure away from
mischief making.
There's another story that Hera alone gave birth to Typhon. Of course, something to do with jealousy over Zeus's, something to do with Zeus.
Zeus did, as usual,
right? And that she alone, I think she was jealous that Zeus had given birth to Athena, born out of his head.
Right. Like, I can. So she's
anything
like, you can do, I can
do better. So she gives birth to Typhon and gives him to the Python to raise. Supposedly, the story goes, or to Kronos. Cronus, not
right.
So
right.
And then the Typhon figure himself is supposed to be the father of Cerberus, the three-hounded.
Is that true?
Hound of Hell. Well, thus have I read. Who knows if it's true with mythologies, because they all contradict each other. Yeah. And also supposed to be the father of the Sphinx. And also supposed to be the father of Scylla, the monster, the Scylla and Charybdis legend. And also the father of Gorgon, who was the mother of Medusa. So very interesting lineage there.
Typhon's supposed to be the father?
Supposedly.
Wow, that's interesting. And it's curious to me because he's set as an enemy of Zeus in that way, because if you look at an ancient map, all of these monsters of Typhon are around the edge, preventing the travel of people to distant places, which is what Jupiter is about.
Yeah, interesting.
So you have this kind of like confrontation of those two
Here
values.
there be dragons.
Here there be dragons and monsters and whirlpools and all sorts of dreadful things you don't want to encounter. Okay, so we should probably continue on, since we've been talking about Jupiter. with more Jupiter references. We see the thunderbolts, of course, associated with
definitely
Jove.
The lightnings. The colors are obviously of the scale. We can talk about those later. But then there's that triangle with the center of the spoke of the wheel is kind of fastened. To, I don't know if you look at the card. Yeah, on the Thoth card, if you look behind the wheel, you'll see this like giant triangle, and you'll see that the center of the wheel is about the position where the eye in the triangle might be. That's a Jupiter reference because, so what was it called? In centrum, centri, trigono, or something like that,
You got
is like the center of the pyramid. So if you look at a pyramid, imagine it was clear, the point that you don't see at the center of the opposite side would be around that point. And it's also called the eye in the triangle often. So the reason that's a Jupiter reference has to do with the OTO's Rites of Jupiter, which is kind of like a public play they put on. And in that play, it has a giant wheel on the stage and 3 actors portraying these 3 figures, the Sphinx, the Hermanubis, and the Typhon. And in, somewhere in there, the Typhon figure hails the Hermanubis figure and says to Hermanubis, "O messenger of Jupiter," and the Hermanubis hails Typhon back and says, "Hail to you, Typhon, executor of his vengeance." And so what that seems to be saying is that they're both functions of Jupiter. They're both helping Jupiter in some way. Hermanubis as his messenger and Typhon as executor of Zeus's vengeance somehow. And then, but they have the Sphinx above them, and they seem to like consider her not of them. They ask her, because she's so high above them or whatever, "Where are you?" And she reveals that she's also bound to the wheel. And that sets off a whole dialogue between them and this eye in the triangle, which is considered like it's this oracular device. The oracle answers them and tries to explain to them how it is that they need to merge together as one in order to achieve the center of the wheel, where things are stillness, in order to no longer be bound to the wheel as separate functions.
Wow. I wonder how that was received in public.
I wish I could have seen it.
I wish I could have too.
But in that play, it's kind of becomes obvious that the Sphinx is the will, where the Typhon figure is the emotion or the heart of the figure. So there's the desire nature and the whole emotional thing. Because you'll see it, because I forget the exact quotes, but it's obvious that the Typhon figure is full of emotion and desire, whereas the ape figure, the Hermanubis figure, is the mind, and he's the one trying to bring reason into everything. And so, but they're each faulty, because without mind and emotion and will all working together, there is no stillness.
Well, this is very much like the Platonic triangle that we talked about in the Chariot, where there's that will, reason, and appetite that you cannot... they're pulling in opposite directions, and you need something to mediate. You need to have them all working together.
Yes.
So also Jupiter references everywhere seem to have to do with the number 4, which is the number of Hesed, which is the Sephira associated with Jupiter. And we see in both cards, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. It's second only to 10. So in the weight card, we have the 4 beasts of Ezekiel, which you can look up. We've talked about them a lot in the Hierophant card and in the Chariot
and then
card.
We have the 4 letters tarot, which could also spell...
Rota
or
for wheel,
or
Ator,
Ator
right?
for Hathor,
right?
Or Orat, which I think is that the law or speech, something like that. Yeah.
And then you have the Tetragrammaton between
between the letters,
counterchange between the letters,
the Yod He Vav He,
and the fact that the Living Creatures of Ezekiel all have books, that might be a reference to the 4 apostles, because sometimes we equate them with the 4 apostles. Who knows? It's somewhere there in Waite's giant Christian soup. And then I suppose in the center of the wheel, you always have in this particular card, it just feels like a compass. It feels like the cardinal directions.
The 8-spoked wheel is also the wheel of Dhamma.
Right.
In Buddhist tradition, it looks like a kind of like a wheel.
And the 8-point star is the star of Lakshmi, who is the goddess of fortune.
Ah, yes.
Which is interesting.
Interesting. Too. Very good.
Yep.
Nice.
But we have on the... so we also have some references to 4 in the Thoth card in terms of all of these 4-pointed stars everywhere, right? And then we have these, sort of 4 lightning bolts reflected across the vertical axis. So you have 8 of them. And then 8-pointed star at the top, looks like. Yep. But then instead of an 8-spoked wheel, we have a 10-spoked wheel.
Or that's a 10-spoked star at the top. The big one in the center?
Ooh,
that's
right.
10.
You are right. Okay, so...
But these other stars around it are all 4.
So we've got 4-pointed stars, and then we have a central 10-pointed star and a 10-spoked wheel.
Never mind. But there's these little 4 at the tips of the lightning bolt.
Yeah.
Those are 4s. Yeah. And then see the little fist, the little hand at the very bottom of the wheel on the rim? The hand that turns the wheel.
The hand that turns the wheel. Yep.
And we were talking about that, I think, a little bit when we talked about the hermits. The hermit's letter being yod, meaning hand. What's the difference between this card, kaf, meaning sometimes fist, sometimes palm? And I think what I said there is that I consider the yod card as being the manifestation of the hand of manifestation, I guess, if you will. Whereas this is the action of the opening and closing of the hand that, that drives the wheel that makes the motion, and it's in constant motion, opening and closing, giving and taking away.
I think of it as outstretched hand receiving the blessings of Jupiter as well, even though
it can be fortune telling of the palm,
and the fortune telling of and the Hamsa talismanic
of protection,
averting evil. The hand with the eye on it, which is another reference. And I think it's, regardless of exactly the position of the hand or what it's doing, it's always interesting to me to think of the hand associated with the wheel because of the idea that there's agency, or the idea that who is turning that wheel. It always, the question, it could be chance, it could be Jupiter, the gods, it could be you. And, and that's always the question, who is in charge. Another Jupiter reference we find in the fact that this path runs between Chesed, the Sephira of Jupiter, and Netzach, the Sephira of Venus. So,
right.
So you have the greater and the lesser benefic.
Right. So in astrology, those are the 2 planets that are most associated with good fortune and,
good stuff.
Beneficial results.
Which is why...
And it's on the pillar of mercy.
On the pillar of mercy. So it's all ice cream all the time. Whenever you see the Wheel of Fortune, I think, it's very hard to read it as a poor omen. It's just...
Right. Although, truthfully, it is, perpetual change. And nothing can stay on top of the wheel forever. So it's kind of to be taken in context.
Exactly. Oh, and speaking of the tree, the 10-spoked wheel could have to do with the 10 Sephirot, or Malkut itself.
Right, and so in Waite's card, you have the 8-spoked wheel. In Crowley's card, you have the 10-spoked wheel. And in the Golden Dawn deck, we don't see here, but it's got the 12-spoked wheel for the whole zodiac. The revolution of the year.
Right. We haven't mentioned in the context of number 4, I'm not sure we've mentioned explicitly, the Sphinx's 4 powers. We kind of touched on it.
The 4 powers of the Sphinx. So I guess we can mention them here again. So the 4 powers are related to the 4 suits or 4 worlds, or 4 elements, or however you want to, all the many ways of you can say 4: to will, to dare, to know, and to keep silent. So to will, the fire force; to dare, the water force; to know, the air element; and to keep silent, that's the earth element, the silence. And then those, if the adept masters the 4 powers, he then has the power to go. And that's perpetual motion, to go. And now here we have the wheel that's always going, always turning.
Interestingly, both Mel and I had, you've had a lifetime fascination with the wheel. Mine has been a relatively more recent one, but I've been, interested in enough in it that I've wanted to have the wheel in my life as a sort of a little central devotional figure. And so, I remember we talked really early when we first met about the wall of wheel, which is something that is gradually forming on my sewing room wall, on my office wall, where, I have many
wheel
versions
and
of the
woe.
Wheel and woe. Gradually, more and more versions of the wheel are creeping across my wall.
Nice.
Even as we speak.
You might want to mention your riddle, the riddle of the Sphinx.
The riddle of the Sphinx. Sphinx. So the riddle of the Sphinx is what goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? And the answer, of course, is
man.
Us, right?
Yeah. And the Sphinx is a symbol of man.
Exactly. And the idea here is that there's a surrender of this idea that you are always one thing. You know, the idea that you are constantly changing, that you're mortal, that you're going to die. And, you know, and there's a sort of divorcing of yourself from your ego in admitting that.
Yeah, and that brings up, so when Oedipus gives the correct answer to that riddle, what does the Sphinx do?
She self-immolates.
She throws herself into the sea. And you can, if you look at that on the Tree of Life, she throws herself into the sea. Binah? She throws herself into Binah. She gives up all, you know, crosses the abyss and returns back to the... And in the message, I think, in order to do that, to cross, is that you have to give up all attachments, all worldly attachments, all those, you know, you're done. Here you go.
So, as we were saying earlier about the hand or the fist or the outstretched palm, right? I'm going to repeat what I said in the Hermit, which is that the palm is also associated with the palm branch of the palm tree, which provides shade and protection. Same word, cuff. And so naturally, in the Book of Thoth, Crowley has something to say about cuff, and the first letter being K and the second letter being Phi or Phi. The K, the kappa, is short, he says, for ktes, and the Phi or Phi for phallos. I'm sure you can imagine what phallos is, and since you know what phallos is, I bet you can imagine what ktes is. So, you know.
Of course he did.
Of course he did. He went there. He always does. Another really interesting thing about the attribution of Kaf is that it is associated in the Sefer Yetzir, or at least in some interpretations of it, as the dual, like all of the planets, it has a dual nature, set of opposites. And for Jupiter, it's riches and poverty.
Well, how perfect. The open hand and the closed hand.
Right.
Exactly. Giving and taking away.
Right.
The giving of fortune in its reverse.
And also the idea of palms, since palm the tree and palm the hand are cognate, you know, there's the idea of palms as victory, you know, and there's that triumphal spirit to the Jupiter card.
Yes. One of my favorite things about the Thoth version of this card is notice how at the top there's a mirror wheel above so there's like a wheel we see its face of vertically, and then there's another wheel that's in the horizontal position above it.
You're right. That's
and it's
remarkable.
Like the gears. It's like 2 gears of the universe or something.
I have never noticed. I've literally never noticed that
the way they did that, because it also reminds me of, you know, the Phi symbol where you have the 0 with the 1 through it, and it looks like a spoke in a wheel.
Right.
I don't know. Right. I just think it's, you know, the laws of nature and the greater universe turning as our mundane world turns. More as above, so below.
More as above, so below. The combination of the 0 and the 1. The great power button, or the salt symbol of matter, is also like that circle with
the line through it. Oh, that's horizontal, but still.
Yeah, but, you know.
Binary symbols. The 0 and the 1 of computer programming language.
Exactly.
The code is written.
From which everything derives. You can, you know, and also associate
the point and the line.
The point and the line, the fool and the magus.
Phallus and the yoni. What is it? The pillar in the void.
The pillar in the void. Nice. Yeah, and there is that idea that 10 reduces to 1 as well, you know, that...
Right, bringing back in the magus.
Exactly.
And also, we could, if we want to go there about reduction of numbers, that's the sun also reduces to 10, the 1 and the 9, the 19 reduces to 10, the wheel, and then reduces to 1. So there's sort of a relationship between those 3 cards. Right. And it's one of the few cards that has 3, you know, a series of 3 by reduction.
And they're all planets: Sun, Mercury, Jupiter.
Sun, Mercury, and Jupiter,
relationship there.
All,
Curious, huh?
Yeah, very much so. There's some meaning there to meditate on.
Okay, color? Want to talk color?
So we've got violet as the king scale color, and you see in Crowley's card, it's all lots and lots of violet. And then there's the blues of Jupiter and purples, and then I think there's a blue or a purple rayed yellow, which is where all the
bright blue rayed yellow is the idea. Yep. Purple and violet are colors of kingship, as we know, and the blue, of course, is also reflected in the weight card, along with clouds. So again, a reference to the sky god.
Hesed and Netzach. Their colors, I mean, the Jupiter colors in Hesed are obviously all over the card. And then the Netzach is green. So, there is a little bit of a kind of a greenish tinge to these creatures in their shading. I don't know if that was intentional, but probably.
Who knows?
I think it was. Or it could just be the blue.
I mean, if you had to shade them anyway, you might as well make them shaded green.
Yeah, the blue and the yellow. It looks like blue shading with the yellow creatures kind of formed green naturally or something like that.
Yeah.
And then in alchemy, this card has to do with circulation, the revolving and the circulating function. At least that makes sense.
That makes some sense. That goes with it. Okay.
It's like with a still, what happens in circulation is when you boil down if you're making booze, you boil down the wort or the must, and that's been fermented, and it purifies it and takes out the dross, and the vapor rises up. So vapor is kind of associated with Jupiter being moist air or whatever. Yeah. So then the vapor rises up and condenses in the coils.
Well, that also makes me think of the expansive Jupiter. And when you have a wheel, you don't just have constant motion, but you have the centrifugal force.
All right, of expansion.
Where things, spiral out, which you can see very clearly in the Thoth card.
Right, those spirals just radiating out. Cool.
Yeah, and of course that expansiveness goes with the pillar of force and its, nature of constant outward projection as opposed to contraction and forming and shaping on the pillar form. So those colors, blue and purple, are associated with the stones amethyst and lapis lazuli, which are typically associated with Jupiter.
Yes, the amethyst and the lapis.
Yeah.
Two lovely stones.
They are lovely stones.
And the blue is also the stone. The stone of Sagittarius is turquoise, which is also
really?
that pretty sky blue color.
Closer to the weight version than the Thoth version. Well, I guess there's
definitely some turquoise blue in the sky here.
Yep, there sure is. I'm never sure about the color registration in the Thoth because we've seen so many
different versions.
Yeah.
Well, it's true of both decks actually.
So natural correspondences are all Jovian correspondences, like the oak and the hyssop and the eagle and the owl, these regal sky birds and the king of trees. Interestingly, the odors that go with Jupiter are also considered expansive odors. They're odors that carry the main one I don't actually have with me, which would be saffron, but we all know what saffron smells like. It has that wonderful, not only the incredible
I'm just
golden color, well, not only the beautiful color, which just seems to go everywhere. It is a dye, right? Again, expansive. It just you get something in saffron and it's permanently golden.
I always considered saffron a solar herb. Of the sun.
Yeah, no, this is just, this is one, one philosopher's
version. The threads are red, but when you put it in water, it turns brilliant golden yellow, which
I think that, saffron, frankincense are definitely solar as well, but I think there are connections between the sun and Jupiter, yeah,
definitely.
Saying, right?
Yeah.
So
both large gaseous bodies in our solar system anyway.
The 10 and the 10.
Yes.
Right. So I have a few more that are associated with Jupiter here. They are, one thing that you find in a lot of the literature is this reference to line or lignum aloe, which I think people generally agree is agar wood, otherwise known as oud, which is why it's the basis for my Sagittarius perfume, ruled by Jupiter.
And we are both wearing Sagittarius now for this podcast.
Even now.
For inspiration.
Indeed. And actually it was Mel who persuaded me to, I brought the synthetic version, not the natural version.
I better not sniff too
Sorry
much
about
of that. Then.
Yeah. But oud is this wonderful resinous growth, I guess, that you find on the agar wood tree that has sort of a pruniness and depth and fruitiness that you don't find in all woods. So that's associated with Jupiter. And actually, hold on a sec. Let me just look that up real sec, because it's interesting to think about. It's a product of disease, isn't it? Let's see. Fragrant dark wood.
Mold. Infected with a tree infected with a type of mold.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so...
And then the resin probably oozes out from...
Yeah. No, I like that because I like the idea... So oud is... Okay, so oud is produced from a tree that is infected with a kind of mold. That's why it's so expensive and hard to get. But it's interesting to me, like, interpretationally, because here you have something that's happened to the tree, something that's... It will mean the death of the tree, and yet it yields this, fragrant, beautiful resin that's prized by us. And that just seems, so very much a part of the cycle of change and death and fortune altogether, how the inevitable demise of the tree gives rise to this expensive, beautiful, fortune-related fragrance. Okay, and then a couple of other things that go with it are, I didn't bring Storax because we smell Storax like practically every time. But I did bring Peru Balsam, which is associated, yet another resin, and oak moss, which I love the smell of oak moss. It's got this, that
I like that too.
It's
like, it reminds me of the sea, the ocean.
Yeah. Nutmeg is also associated with Jupiter. But
Jupiter being exalted in Cancer. Maybe that's the ocean.
There's a nice connection. Jupiter exalted in Cancer. Right. Ruling Pisces as well. There's
there's another one.
Yeah.
Pisces, because Jupiter, for those of you listening, Jupiter rules both Sagittarius and Pisces, because classical planets, there were only 7 of them, so they double up on
except for the sun and the moon. Right. And there's a logic and an order to that. And it's interesting, Sagittarius and Pisces, because of the fire and water that, you can perhaps read into that steamy clouds on the Wheel of Fortune, if you were in that frame of mind. Okay, so the color, as we were saying, are blue and violet, which means that depending on which one you use, you get different notes.
Thought the king scale one is violet.
The king scale one. I usually do the Sephira first, which would be blue, which is G sharp is associated with the color blue, the Sephira Chesed, and the number 4 in the planet Jupiter. And then we have violet, which is, as you were saying, associated with the Absolutic path, which is A sharp for violet, or purple. Any of those are all associated with A sharp. So they're pretty close. It's not that different, but you still have to make a choice if you happen to be up at 7 a.m. intoning or vibrating the name of Jupiter. Not that anyone I know does that. Okay, anyway, so hats off to the Lord of the Forces of Life. That was the Wheel of Fortune, and we will be back next time with Justice or Adjustment.